Okay, so without further ado, we're going to get into the actual coursework. So I've broken this course into 5 distinct chapters, and each of these chapters has a lot of illustrative games showing you sort of a wide range of sort of topics within topics. But the first one is a topic that's very close to my heart, which is attacking the king. And like many chess players, I was sort of grew up looking over games of like Paul Morphy and the Immortal game and things like this, crazy King's Gambits. And while that stuff has been almost completely forgotten in modern times. Maybe not forgotten, but it's not really seen in play. There's a whole new level of modern attacking that is coming out very quickly, and it's coming. It's showing in both club and elite level chess. And I've selected several games here that I think are very interesting in terms of attacking play. And there's a wide range. You'll see this kings in the center and trying to bash through before they're developed. Just same side castling, attacking, opposite side castling, attacking, closed position, open position. There's a wide range of attacking possibilities, and there are some players who really excel at this. I myself am not really one of them, but I still do it well enough that I hope I can teach something about it. And I think I learned quite a lot just from preparing these lessons and then talking about them. So I'm actually glad from that, and hopefully if I can learn something, you can too. So overall in this course, about half of the games are games that of my own, and the other half are games that made a strong impression on me one way or another, either from seeing them live or following them online or studying them closely when I was young, or even as a very strong player looking and thinking, wow, that was an amazing game. Yeah, I should probably learn something from that. But I chose a wide range of attacking games, and when there's attack, there's always defense, and so even in some of these games, the attacks do not succeed, but you're going to want to be calculating every move and using calculation to try to make your attacks work. And at some point, I'm going to try to ask you, here's a very strong attack, how do you defend against it? There's going to be a lot of candidate moves in attacking positions. That's sort of the way things often work. But in any case, who doesn't love attacking? I think it's an important part of the game, and I hope you enjoy the first chapter of this series. All right, so welcome to the series. For the first game, we're going to see really fun one. It's probably not the best example of just strict tactical play, but we're going to see a lot of the kind of themes that we're going to be looking at. And in general, just to whet the appetites of everyone around, I'd like to just go over a very interesting and very fun game. So this was a game played between Sergei Volkov and Bartosz Sashko at the Rilton Cup some years ago. And, well, it was quite interesting. So we're going to skip through the opening reasonably fast, but I do want to sort of show how it goes just to set the stage for what happens next. So game starts d4, knight f6, c4, e6, knight c3, bishop b4. This is the Nimzo, and the two main moves here are e3 or queen c2. But Volkov has been a long-time expert on the move f3, and this is the way this game proceeded. So black has several options here, but in the game he chose d5. So a3, takes, castles, cd, ed, e3. Now, this position has been reached a fair amount of times. I think that what people are mainly doing is b6. I don't actually think this is one of the best ways for black to play against the f3 Nimzo. Here, I sort of like white's position, but in this case, black played knight h5. And so the point of this move is what white would really like to do, like for example, if black had played b6, white's proper coordination is to play bishop d3, and then say something like bishop a6, knight e2. He gets his pieces out this way. He will castle short, the knight will come to g3, and white will try to slam through with e4. I even had a game in the previous series that I looked at, which was very similar to this with Sanakitse. So you can check that out in the other series I did. In any case, in this game, black played knight h5. And his goal with this move, obviously the knight on h5 isn't as good as it was on f6, but he's trying to disturb white's coordination so that white is unable to achieve this. So for example, if white were to just ignore black and say, well, let's see if nothing happens, bishop d3, black has a tactical resource at his disposal here. Let's see if you can find it. Alright, so if you're on time, please pause your videos. This is not an especially challenging one. Black goes queen h4 check, and no matter what white does, whether it's g3 or king somewhere, it doesn't matter. After knight g3, the rook on h1 will be lost. So for example, after king f1, knight g3 check, h takes g3, queen takes h1, black is winning material. And the queen is not going to get trapped. So black's basically winning. Instead of that, of course, Volkov's a strong grandmaster. He's not just going to walk into something that simple. White went with the move knight e2. And here we sort of see the point of black's play is that white was compelled to put knight on e2. I mean, now queen h4 check doesn't work, of course, because g3 the queen is just kicked away. But with the knight on e2, this has blocked white's bishop and messed up his coordination. Really, the white bishop wants to be on d3 here. So this is sort of black's idea. Game continues, rook e8. And now it's not that easy for white to develop his pieces effectively. He really wants to get the bishop to d3. So what he chooses to do is, in my opinion, the best move, which is g4. And with this, he's kicking back the knight. So after knight f6, now white will play knight g3. And next up, he can play bishop d3, and he will castle. And the kingside looks a little bit loose, but white is ready to start throwing with moves like e4, and I think he has a good position. So black, of course, was a little bit more proactive than that, and he went ahead and gave the check on h4. White now is forced to play king d2, knight f6. And here, white's king has sort of been kicked into the center, but black is not equipped to attack it. The king's quite safe where he is. He's guarded by a lot of pawns. And white still has a big pawn center and a healthy bishop pair. So in general, I prefer white in this position, but there's still a lot of chess to be played. So the game continues, queen e1. Black doesn't really want to exchange queens because he's statically worse for the reasons I just described. White has more space, big pawn center, and bishop pair. But and his big problem is that his king is kind of dubious. So black's would like to keep queens on the board. Is if the king is uncomfortable for white, black's going to try to avoid exchanges. So queen h6, black is now threatening the pawn on e3. So white just develops with knight f4, and now black plays c5. This is a very natural move. He's trying to blow up in the center where the white king is. Bishop d3, and now black plays b6. So this is where the fun really starts, and where I think we should pause for a minute and sort of discuss the position in a little bit more detail. So black is hoping to play the move bishop a6. That's why he's played b6. If he can achieve this move, he'll either force an exchange of bishops, which will definitely be in black's favor, because it removes the bishop pair, and will leave white with this bad bishop on c1 instead of the active bishop on d3. Sorry, bishop b2 was not played. It's just me touching the piece. So bishop d3, this is a good bishop. You don't want him to get exchanged. Bishop c1 you wouldn't mind as much. But, you know, bishop a6, you'd really rather this not happen. And so, you know, it's not exactly ideal. And if bishop a6, bishop c2, then black has this bishop on a very nice diagonal, and he can follow with like knight c6, knight a5, knight c4 check, and look for good play against white's weakened king. So that's what black wants to do. But at the moment, there's two problems in his position, and I'd like everyone to pause their videos and see if they can figure out what the two major problems black is facing. So if anyone would like more time, please keep your videos paused, but I'm going to go ahead and proceed. So problem number one is that the d5 pawn is a bit of a target. It's defended for now, but if you could get rid of this knight on f6, then the pawn on d5 would just hang. Secondly, black's queen on h6 is kind of short on squares. So if you could even attack the queen right now, you'd almost trap her. So this sort of implies white's next move, which is h4. Which is the best move. So now white is threatening g5, which would win the game. So for instance, if black were to ignore this and play bishop a6, after g5, white is going to win the queen. So black has to do something about that. If he tries to make a square with g6, this saves the queen, but he still loses a piece after g5 because the knight on f6 is hanging. So essentially, black is forced to move the knight. So he goes knight f to d7. And, you know, at this point, this is where white really has to think a bit about what's going on and how he should proceed in this position. So I'd like everyone to pause their videos, and this is the first really, really critical moment of the game that we're going to be looking at. And take as much time as you need and see if you can figure out what should white play in this position. Alright, so if at this point you want more time, you're going to have to pause your videos, but white has a very good move here, but I'm going to start. So the first thing you should be asking yourself is, well, can I get away with grabbing this pawn on d5? I mean, after all, what we had just discussed was that pawn on d5 was a bit loose, and, well, now that the defender is left, can we simply take it? But unfortunately, the answer is no. If you start calculating, you realize that black actually is getting a lot of activity after c takes d4. So white does not have time to go rook grabbing after rook takes e3. He's going to get himself killed. But let's say c takes d4. And at first this looks very tempting. I mean, white is now a pawn up, and he is attacking, threatening knight c7. He's got a big center, and unless black has something very concrete, white should just be much better. But unfortunately for black, white does have something, for white, excuse me, black does have something very concrete. He can play knight c6. And it's funny, here black is just ignoring all of white's threats. He ignored knight takes d5, and now he's ignoring knight c7, but as it turns out, his threats are much stronger. So after knight c7, knight takes d4, white is completely crushed. Knight takes f3 is a massive threat, knight b3 is a massive threat. The whole house is falling down, and there's absolutely nothing white can do about it. So, well, you might say, okay, now you can't play knight c7 to win more material, but you're still a healthy pawn up. What if you simply defend the threat to the pawn on d4? But then there follows knight a5, and there's a threat of knight b3 check. So, for example, if knight c7, knight b3, black's going to win, for instance, king c2, knight a1, and after something like bishop a1, rook takes e3. Next up, black will get rook b8 in, and he'll be material up, and the white king is wide open. So this is definitely not what white wants. But there is other moves you could try, I guess. Say, I don't know, knight takes d5 clearly doesn't really work, but maybe you could try, say, g5. This is an idea saying, well, at least we're kicking the queen, and then we're going to get h5 next. But the problem is after queen d6, h5, white does have some attacking chances with g6 coming in and stuff like that, but he's just a bit too slow. Like, after bishop a6, black's play is faster. So if takes, now there's really nothing for white to do, because without the bishop on d3, he's not going to have any serious attacking chances. After g6, black can simply ignore it and leave the pawn there. There's nothing bad is going to happen to him. He can play something like cd, rook a, c8, and get a lot of counterplay down the open c file. So let's say white plays bishop c2 to try to preserve the bishop. And once again, he's ready for something like g6, but unfortunately black's just too fast. cd, knight c6, and yeah, white gets g6 in here, and it seems nice and everything, but actually it's just too slow. For instance, here already knight takes d4 is a massive threat, and if white tries g6, knight takes d4 is very clearly a bigger threat. Knight c2 is incoming, knight f3 would win the house if it happened right now. White cannot stop both of them, and the whole position just falls apart at the seams. So we have to respect the threat of knight takes d4. So let's say white plays queen g3, which unpins the e-pawn, but unfortunately after knight a5, again, black's play is just faster. Knight c4 check is going to be really, really painful. So this wasn't really working. And white had to look for some pretty drastic measures. And the move he found, I think, was absolutely brilliant. And the computer, at first, it would not even make the top 20 choices. It just looks completely insane. But it's actually very clever. If we recall, after h4, the real point was we were trying to trap this queen. And now that the knight on f6 has moved, when it was here, the queen would be trapped. Now that it's gone, this queen can move along the 6th rank to get to safety on d6. What if you find a way to block the 6th rank? Well, it seems impossible, but actually, if you think creatively, what if? And you just land on this move, bishop g6. And actually, at first it looks completely insane. You're just hanging a bishop for nothing. But once you start calculating, you realize it's a lot more serious than it looks. First of all, if f takes g6, g5 simply traps the queen. There's nothing else to it. So black has to be worried. g5 is now a very real threat. f g6 doesn't stop it. In the game, black played h takes g6, which we'll get back to. The last thing I'd like to talk about is queen takes f4, which seems like, okay, well now, no queen getting trapped, we're just trading all this stuff, and now ultimately black has 2 pieces for a rook, but he's 1 tempo too slow because white gets rook e8 check in, knight f8 and rook takes c8, and white is completely winning. He's got an exchange up, and both of black's knights are immortally pinned, so the game is absolutely over. So the only way after bishop g6 to deal with this threat of g5 is to play h takes g6. But now after g5, the queen is very out of play, and most importantly, black now is unable to stop the h-file from opening with h5. Here, h takes g6 is coming. If white gets it next move, it will trap the queen on the spot. So the question then becomes, well, what can black do about it? And as it turns out, not much, because for instance, if he were to play g takes h5, you go rook takes h5, now the only square for the queen is queen f5, but after queen h4, black will get himself checkmated in short order. So for instance, say king f8, otherwise, rook h8 is just going to be mate. The other way, I guess, would be f6, but after g6, white is giving mate here, and the queen is hanging on f5 even. So king f8, and now g6, and the black queen is hit. her only square is f6, and then just some rudimentary calculation shows white winning after rook h8 check, king e7, knight takes d5 check, and well, the queen will be lost, and white will have a raging attack and extra material instead of the other way around. So that's completely winning. But then the problem becomes, well, how on earth does black even stop h takes g6, simply winning the queen? This is an incredible tactical idea. So in the game, Sashko came up with the best move, which is still bad, but it's, something, which was king f8. This clears the g8 square for the queen. So now h takes g6 is an obvious move, queen g8. But here it's not that easy to improve further, because after all, white is still down a piece. So a tempting move might be something like knight takes d5, taking a second pawn and getting the knight in. But after f takes g6, black gets the pawn back, and now the knight on d5 is hanging and forced to retreat. So that's not correct. What white needs to do is bring another piece into the attack. So I'd like everyone to pause their videos and see if they can figure out how should white proceed in this position. Alright, so if you want more time, keep them paused. At this point, I'm going to go ahead. Essentially, white is not attacking with enough pieces now. A lot of his pieces are not performing an active role. But it's going to be very, very hard for the c1 bishop and the a1 rook to get into the attack. It's just going to be really, really slow. So much more to the point is for white to try to get his queen into the game. That's what he does here with the move queen g3. Now, white wants to play knight takes d5 next. So, for example, if black were to go along on his merry way with bishop a6, which is a move we've seen from him a lot, now, after knight takes d5, black does not have time for f takes g6 because white has, like, queen f4 check, and the game ends on the spot. Since queen f7, rook h8 is mate, the queen on g3 makes all the difference in the world. So in the game, black tried bishop b7, defending the pawn on d5, and then this is sort of a little bit of a throwback to the previous video series that I did, which is if you have an idea, a positional idea, in this case I want to grab the pawn on d5 and bring the queen to d6, and your opponent prevents you from doing it, as he is here with bishop b7 defending the pawn, the first question you should ask yourself is what happens if I just do it anyway? And as it turns out, it doesn't even require that much calculation for white to justify this, so you can go ahead and play knight takes d5. Now, queen d6 is a very hard threat to stop. For example, if bishop takes d5, queen d6 check, black must play rook e7, queen takes d5, and now actually the rook on a8 is simply hanging and cannot be saved. So white actually will end up material here after all that sacrificing, which is kind of cool. But what else can black do? He could try something like rook e6, but I think simply knight c7 is good enough. White is grabbing some material back, and he keeps a raging attack. So, black did his best to do what he could with the move knight e5. And this is kind of clever, because the point is now if d takes e5, black can play bishop takes d5, and there's no more check on d6, because the pawn on e5 is in the way. And if knight c7, black has something like knight c4 check, or knight takes f3 check with some counterplay. But Volkov found another excellent move in g takes f7. At this point, black does not really have a good way to capture the pawn, because if king takes f7, there'll be queen f4 check and black will get mated. For instance, if king e6, queen e5 check is, well, in addition to being mated, it's also equalizing material, so white doesn't have to worry further, say king c7. I'm sure the computer is pointing out forced checkmate, but I will point out queen takes b7, where white has a gross amount of extra material for absolutely nothing. And if king g6, then white has a very nice mate here with rook h6 check. Takes, queen f6 check, and no matter where the king goes, queen h6 is mate. So this was a pretty gruesome attack there. Black could try queen takes f7, but then rook h8 check is winning the queen on the spot, and white again has extra material. So black had to go knight takes f7. And now white plays knight c7, now that the knight has been kicked away from e5 and cannot go knight takes f3 or knight c4. And here, if we pause and take stock of the position, at the moment black is up a piece for 2 pawns. He's going to lose an exchange, so white will have a rook and 2 pawns for 2 pieces. But in addition, now his center pawns are looking really good, and black's king is wide open. So after black played g6, which was the only move, because otherwise white was going to play g6, for instance, if black were to develop, let's say, knight c6. After g6, the game is over. The knight is hit, and it has to be the one who's guarding moves like queen f4 and queen d6. So black had to play g6. And now, probably the best move is e4, but I don't really object to Volkov's move either, which was d5. And so here what white is doing is accepting. At this point, material is relatively close to equal. I guess white could be up a little bit. But now white's sort of starting to play positional. He's putting his pawns on light squares, which opens up his bishop and closes down his opponent's. And indeed, he just continued this policy. Knight d7, e4. White doesn't need to bother taking one of the rooks until one of them moves, because as soon as the rook moves, then he'll have to take the other one. But as long as they're both hanging, he doesn't need to rush, and I kind of like the flexibility left, because in some cases he might want to play knight e6 check. So black tried knight d5, and now apparently the best move was a4, but Volkov found a much more human move, which was king c2. It's a very simple move. White wants to bring in more pieces to the attack. Like we said, the bishop and the rook on a1 and c1 were going to take a while to bring into the attack. But now that White has gained enough time to do so, it seems like he's doing very well, because here he's getting ready for bishop f4. So rook ac8 was played. And now White certainly could take the rook on e8, and after something like rook takes e8, bishop f4, I think White's clearly better here. The pawns are really good, and his pieces are all excellent, and his king is safer. But Volkov was even more relentless and went with the move knight e6 check. And so now black cannot take this knight on a pain of d takes e6 when now White has a rook and two pawns for two pieces, which is close to equal material imbalance, but black is losing another piece on the spot after because the knights are hanging. So black had to play king e7, and now bishop f4, and the attack is just raging on. This knight is really short on squares, and all of White's pieces are excellent. I feel like the queen on g8 has performed absolutely no active role at all ever since this bishop g6 move. So the computer is recommending king d6, which I do not think will save the game, but it's probably the best try. Instead, knight c4 was played. I know there's no shortage of good moves, but I like Volkov's choice, which was just to double along the h-file, increasing the pressure. He is including the last piece, the a1 rook, in the attack. So rook e d8. It's funny now, black is like just putting the rook on a square where it can be taken. He just realizes that the knight is so much better than either of his rooks. But Volkov does not oblige. He certainly could play a rook to h1 here, but he played a4 first simply to save the pawn, I guess. Queen e8 was tried, and White has several winning moves here. The best probably was queen h2, but in the game he played bishop c7, which isn't bad at all either. I mean, he's trying to take this this rook twice. His point is that if black goes rook d7, now after queen f4, queen f6 is going to be exceptionally painful, and there's absolutely nothing black can do about it. So black tried knight e3 check, and after king c1, rook takes d5, e takes d5. I mean, rook takes d5 is the move of a desperate man, but there was really nothing else to do, because again, if rook d7, White was going to play queen f4. And really, basically, there's nothing at all to do about queen f4. I mean, it's just going to end the game on the spot. And if you look at how pitiful black's pieces are, I mean, this rook on c8, rook on d8, bishop b7, and queen e8, none of these pieces are coming even remotely close to stopping White's very simple and primitive threat of going like queen f4, queen f6, rook h7. So black tried giving up material. After all, it is White's king that's a little bit more open here. But at the same time, it wasn't that serious. So e takes d5, bishop takes d5. And now White has to be a little precise because he has some hanging pieces, but it doesn't take that much accuracy to win the game. So knight f4. Now if black were to take on c7, which seems like it's hanging, White has knight takes d5 check. And the point is after knight takes d5, rook e4, White will be picking up the queen, and that will be that. So black was unable to do this. Instead, he played king d7. And after knight takes d5, rook e4, queen h8, bishop e5. I think we can call it quits here. It's been a good first lesson, but the rest of the game just wasn't very interesting. I mean, White is now up material for absolutely nothing, and his king is safe enough. Just, I guess, for completeness' sake, I'll go through very quickly, but takes, king d2, and now, in addition to White being up material, it's funny because his king is wide open, but actually black's is in much more danger and will promptly be mated. Rook e8. And now rook a1 would have led to mate, but rook takes e8 is more than good enough. The point is that this rook cannot really be taken, because if queen takes, as was played in the game, rook e1 and the pieces are coming in. You wouldn't want to take this. This would be a mistake after queen h8. The rook is lost. But king takes is even worse after queen b8 when the queen is lost. Computer is suggesting queen d4 check, but it won't change the result of the game. So queen takes c8 was played, and again, White did not blunder with king c3. He just brought another piece in with rook e1, queen h8, and there's no shortage of winning moves here, but Volkov found the best way, so queen g4 check, king d8, queen f4, now queen b8 is a huge threat, king c8, and queen f6, which is pretty nice because it's forcing queens off. If queen takes f6, gf6, the pawn cannot be stopped. So queen h4, and now, well, in case queen takes c3 wasn't good enough. I mean, it obviously was, but white has mate in 2 with queen c6. That was a very nice game from Volkov. Seemed like he really found a brilliant tactical idea with bishop g6, then followed it up with sort of a 1-2 punch. So these are the kind of tactics that you guys are going to be seeing, especially in the beginning. We're going to do a fair amount of king hunting. But in any case, I hope you enjoyed the video. Thanks very much for watching, and we'll see you for the next lesson. Alright, welcome back. So we're going to move on to the second game of the series. This one is another sort of king hunting game. And it's funny, you might look at this position and be like, well, what does this have to do with king hunting? It looks like a typical closed middle game, you know, a6 Slav, white has more space, black's trying to do something about it. But as we'll see, that the king safety becomes a big part of this position. So the first thing you guys should notice when looking at this position is it's black's move here. This was a game between Kachishvili and Gareev at the Copper State Open a long time ago. And I wasn't at this tournament, but I remember watching it live, and the game sort of made a strong impression on me. So let's just speak about the position on general terms for a moment first. At this point, the battle lines are clearly drawn. White has more space, much better coordination. If you look, for example, this bishop on g7 is biting on granite. There's not much it can do. The bishop on h2 is sort of awesome. It's got a wide open diagonal toward the queen side. White has a space advantage as well on the queen side. He's ready for moves like b4, a4, b5 eventually. The bishop on e6 is stuck. It's got nowhere to go. The knight on d7 has nowhere good to go. Knight on f6 has nowhere good to go. Like, black's pieces are just not good. And white has more space. What black would really like to do is make the break e5. This is the typical break you'll see in these structures. But unfortunately, with his bishop on e6, that's not going to happen. And there's nowhere the bishop can go to prepare e5. So it seems like white just has a good position. But there's one problem in his position, which is that, well, actually, I'd like everyone to pause their videos and see if they can figure out what is the issue with white's position. I mean, everything I've said just, like, sounds brilliant. So why is he not just much better? So if you want more time, I definitely suggest pausing your videos. But white's problem is he's behind on development. And, you know, black is already castled, and it seems like it's not that much of a development lead, but as it turns out, it'll really count. So when playing against a space advantage, there's sort of two things you can do. One is to try to trade enough pieces that the space advantage won't matter, and the other is to try to break down the space advantage at the source. So black's first move is not too difficult here, but let's just see. I'd like everyone to pause their videos and see if they can find it. So, if you want time, keep your videos paused. Black should play the move b6. This is an excellent move that challenges white's space advantage. It's attacking the pawn on c5. White could take on c5, but after queen takes b6, black is absolutely fine. He's threatening queen takes b2. He is, I mean, that would win a pawn. Black, he's sort of quote-unquote threatening c5, and that wouldn't win material, but it's a strategic gain for him. He's, you know, breaking down white's space advantage further. And after something like castle, I think black is absolutely fine after c5, or queen takes b2 for that matter. In both cases, I think he has a totally fine position. So what white really needs to do to try to maintain his space advantage is play b4. And here black has to choose what to do next. He could play a5. This is sort of the typical Queen's Gambit style move where you just, you know, put more pressure on the pawn chain. And white would not want to play a3 here, but he goes b5, and it's also a pretty typical move. And the problem is black has a hard time resolving this tension since c takes b5 is well met by c6, and black is going to be losing material here because knight b8 fails to c7. So he may be not losing material because queen c8, but knight takes b5. This is not a position black wants to play. So that's sort of not good either, but black can play with a lot of energy here. So he goes b takes c5. This opens the b file. Now b takes c5 back. And again, if white could just castle here, he'd be much better. I mean, if he plays castle, queen a4, some rook to b1, black cannot contest the b file because the bishop on h2, it seems like a disaster. But black actually is able to generate a lot of play really fast. So I'd like everyone to pause their videos and see if they can figure out what should black play in this position. Alright, if you want time, keep your videos paused. Black's best move is knight e4. And he's just crashing straight forward with this move. He is threatening to win a piece with knight takes c3. So, if white were to just castle and knight takes c3 kind of wins the game on the spot. So white can't do that. And you might say, okay, well, how does this work? Because the e4 square is not sufficiently protected. For instance, what if white takes on e4? Well, we'll go through that one at a time. So if bishop takes e4, d takes e4, now g5 is a serious threat, which would win the knight on h4. So white must take this pawn. And after bishop d5, now his knight is threatened here. Well, what's he going to do? If knight c3, black can go bishop c4. And now white is not castling, and knight takes c5 is coming. That's not good. So what if white plays knight d2? This seems safe enough. White's ready for e4 and castle. But now we see the point, is black has gotten this bishop out of the way on d5 with tempo, because it was in the way on e6. So now he goes e5, also with tempo, opening up an attack on the h4 knight. This is a lot of tempi that are coming for black very, very quickly. So the game continues, knight hf3, and now e takes d4. And white should play e4 here, which keeps material level, and black has a couple options. He could play something like rook e8, castles, bishop takes e4, but I think white's okay after takes bishop d6. White's a pawn down for the moment, but the bishop on d6 is very strong, and the d4 pawn will likely fall. This should be about equal. But black can also play bishop e6, and after something like bishop d6, well, they have an interesting position. White's got a strong bishop on d6, but we can debate whether black's d4 pawn is a strong passer or a weak Isolani. It's interesting. Black's certainly not worse, but rook e8 was maybe a little bit cleaner. In any case, and if white tries to keep the pawn with e takes d4, now after rook e8 check, black just gets enormous compensation after king f1. He just has to improve his worst piece, which is the knight, and after knight f8, black is ready for knight e6, and the d4 pawn is coming under enormous fire very, very fast. This would leave white in a very bad way. So you might say, okay, well, maybe white should take with the bishop on e4, or sorry, with the knight first, and then the bishop on e4, so that there's no bishop d5 move gaining a tempo. But here we see the point of black's play. After knight takes e4, d takes e4, bishop takes e4, again, if white just had one move here to castle, the game would be basically over. He'd have all the positional trumps we were speaking of before, and he would be a clean pawn up. But black has a very energetic move here. Why don't you guys pause your videos and see if you can find it. Alright, so if you want time, keep them paused. Black can and should play the move knight takes c5. This blows up the position on the spot, equalizes material with a gain of tempo threatening the bishop on e4. Now white should have played bishop c2 here, after which he would have been a bit worse, but probably manageable, something like bishop c2. Still white's ready to castle next, and even then you'd have a better structure, so the computer is recommending something like bishop c4 to stop castling, and after knight f3, knight e6. I think white's inability to castle is more important than black's somewhat compromised pawn structure, but, the computer seems to think white's just about okay. But the critical test, of course, would be what happens if white actually takes the piece. Should point out, taking on c6 would be silly. After bishop c4, then knight d3 check is really going to hurt. So, d takes c5. At this point, black now is down a clean piece. But if we start calculating, we realize that white's just in massive trouble because of the king. Queen a5 check. If white could castle out of check here, I keep reiterating, if he could just castle, he'd be fine. If white could play castles here, he'd be doing great. As is, he can't. He's got to move the king somewhere. Queen d2 fails to bishop c3. White loses a huge amount of material. So he's got to move the king. If king f1, now this rook on h1 is permanently out of the game, and black starts bringing his pieces in with tempo. Rook fd8 is the strongest move. So the white queen is hit. She has to be very careful where she goes, because if she leaves the first rank with a move like queen c2, then after bishop takes a1, black is simply up material. So white has to keep in touch with that rook with a move like, say, queen c1, and now there's no shortage of winning moves, but I quite like bishop takes a1, which seems pretty easy. Queen takes a1, bishop c4 check, king g1, and now it's very strong with bishop e2. Now, white's pieces are so horribly discoordinated. If you look, this rook on h1 and bishop on h2 are just blocking the white king's escape. Rook d1 check cannot be stopped. For instance, if white were to play bishop c2 with the intention of stopping rook d1 check, well, I've spoken about this before. I spoke about it in previous series, is if you have a key positional idea, in this case rook d1 check picking up the white queen, and your opponent stops you from doing it, in this case by playing bishop c2 to defend d1, what happens if I just do it anyway? And we quickly land on the fact that rook d1 check is actually playable and just wins the game on the spot. After rook d1 check, white cannot play bishop takes d1 on account of queen e1 mate. So that's the most gruesome of black's wins, but he has plenty of other options. For example, the simplest and most human, in my opinion, is the move queen a4. So this is a triple threat. It is threatening queen takes e4, it is threatening rook d1 with winning the queen, and if white stops it with the only move that would stop both is bishop f3. And now the computer wants funny business like bishop d5, but I don't care. Let's just grab this knight. At this point, black is a clean exchange up, and white's king is in shambles. The game is completely over. So king f1 doesn't work. Kachishvili tried king e2, which is a bit more resilient because this means that the rooks are connected so that after, you could play rook fd8 or rook a8. In the game, Gareev chose rook a8. The point is here that now the c2 square is available for white's queen, since he no longer needs to keep in touch with the a1 rook, since the h1 rook defends it just fine. But unfortunately for white, the tactical energy in black's position just keeps flowing very easily. So why don't you guys pause your videos and see if you can figure out what black's best move is. Alright, so if you're on time, keep your videos paused. The best move is queen b5 check. And the point is now that white just has nowhere to go with the king. He'd like to go back to e1 just to try to stay safe, but here there's a million winning moves. But again, the simplest is to grab this rook, and black is up in exchange. So he's got to go somewhere else. If bishop d3, black can go ahead and take this bishop. Another tactical point that has to be justified concretely, which is that queen takes d3 is well met by bishop c4. There's a bit more to this variation. For instance, white could try a4, and now the computer is recommending queen b4, which is pretty gruesome, but I think the human move would be rook c3 check. It's certainly the one I would play. And after a takes b5, rook takes c2 check, we're seeing that white's position is still completely in ruins. He's in check. The material is equal for the moment now because black took the bishop on d3. White's in check. His pawn on b5 is hanging. The rook on a1 is hanging. The king is wide open. Black has a gorgeous bishop pair. And after something like king d3, because if white doesn't attack black's rook on c2 in response here, then black will just take material. So he tries king d3, but after rook takes f2, white is completely lost. The rook on a1 is hanging, and something like rook takes a6. And computer is recommending rook d8 check. C takes b5 is also more than good enough. The white king is wide open. He's a pawn down. Black's bishops are ravaging the board. This is not a playable position. So instead, white tried king f3. And here we see another very strong move from black. And it's another thing to keep in mind is when you're attacking, you should always keep a material count in your head. Here, black is down a piece. That's a lot of material, but at the same time, if you just win something back, great. And indeed, black has a way to simply win a piece here. So I'd like everyone to pause their videos, see if they can figure out what that might be. Alright, so if you want time, keep your videos paused. It's a simple move, f5. The bishop on e4 is trapped. And in addition, when black plays f takes e4, it will open up his f8 rook to join the attack. So white tried king g3 just to run away with the king, but black has several winning moves here. I'd be tempted to go ahead and grab this rook, seeing that here black is now up material and attacking, but I like Gareev's move even more, which is to take here. Black reasons that his bishop on g7 is a better attacking piece than the rook on a1 as a defender. At this point, again, material is even. It didn't take that much for the game to go rapidly downhill. So queen takes e4, bishop d5, and black is gaining time with this. The queen is now hit. Where's she going to go? It's hard to even suggest a square. In the game, white tried queen c2, which I suppose makes some sense, but now black is winning every which way, but I really like the way that Timur finished off the game. He played queen b4. And with this move, black is threatening bishop e5 with mate. If he had played bishop e5 first, then white could play f4. And he's still definitely lost after simply taking this rook, but he could put some more resistance. As is, after queen b4, bishop e5 is just mate next move. And it's very, very tough to stop. So for example, if white were to play rook b1 to attack the queen, after bishop e5, f4, bishop takes f4, white finds himself checkmated in short order. You could say, well, what if white plays rook f1 to stop f4? Now g5 is completely crushing. Again, now this is just sort of lessening the strength of f4. If white moves the knight away, then bishop e5 is mate, takes, and queen h4 mate. And if knight f5, again, we have the same mate with rook f5, takes, and queen h4 mate. So in the game, white played f4 preemptively, but then after one more good move from black, white decided he had seen enough. So I'd like everyone to just pause their videos and find the last move of the game. Alright, so if you want time, keep them paused. Black played g5. He's now threatening g takes h4, which will leave him a piece up. He's threatening g takes f4 with mate, and if white plays takes, then black has a pleasant choice between bishop e5 mate and, say, queen b8. But bishop e5 mate looks like a pretty convincing way to end the game. And there was really nothing else white could have done once he grabbed that knight on c5. For instance, going back, I checked some other moves here instead of, like, for example, if white plays queen c1 instead, to try to leave the c2 square available for the bishop after queen b5 check, it doesn't really help. I mean, let's say, if king e1, then black just goes queen b4 check and wins the bishop. But if king f3, now f5 once again. And here, yeah, the bishop escapes, quote-unquote, but after bishop c2, there's really nothing else to it. I mean, the g5 and bishop d5 followed by bishop e5 is once again completely devastating. So I continued the variation here. I mean, it's easy to just quit here saying, like, look, black's a piece down. He's winning his piece back right now with g takes h4 whenever he wants it. And white's king is wide open. But just for its completeness' sake, I'll go over what I covered. So I tried saving the rook with rook b1, but after bishop d5 check, there's not much to be done here. And now gh4 check and queen e2. And white's not going to stop queen h5. And it's pretty clear that his king on g3 would rather switch places with that rook on h1, but as is, the king is completely fried. So I thought this was a very nice attacking effort by Gureyev, and it was showing how the tactics sort of flew from the position when the white king was open, because even though black was down a piece from the start of the analysis, we were seeing lots of variations where just the open position, the loose position of white's pieces meant that black could just take material back and not even worry about the attack anymore. In any case, I thought this was an excellent example of tactics and high-level play. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you for the next lesson.